When I was about 28 years old, which is neither today nor yesterday, I had a profound experience which has stayed with me down the years. It was an evening in early October, and I was about to return to Rome after a long summer break to continue my theological studies. My father had gone ahead to the pub where I was to meet him for a final drink before going to the airport. And I was left alone in the house with my mother. We weren't a particularly demonstrative family. I was brought up at a time before it was fashionable to say, "I love you," indiscriminately. And moments of parting like this were very uncomfortable for us both. I was feeling very sad. My mother wasn't old, but I knew that I would be away for a year, and we both knew that anything might happen at that time. And as I said goodbye, she, who was normally quite stoical, began to cry. We embraced briefly and awkwardly, and off I went to join my father in the pub. As I left the house and crossed the road, I was suddenly overwhelmed by an unaccountable feeling of happiness. My sadness cleared completely, and I had this wonderful sense that my forebodings were misplaced and that everything would turn out well. Not just my anxieties concerning my mother, but everything in my whole life, and what's more, in everybody's life. That one day all tears would be dried, and in the words of Julian of Norwich, all will be well, all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. When I reached the pub, which was a mere quarter of a mile away, the immediate and profound sense of elation had evaporated. It lasted only seconds, a minute at most. But my mood remained exuberant, and I was able to face my journey and my life without a qualm. In fact, this experience has been a source of consolation to me through half a dozen personal bereavements and through a few other occasions when I have fallen and bled on the thorns of life. I don't remember ever speaking about this to anyone, not because I was unnerved or embarrassed by it, but because it never seemed opportune. Until about a decade later, I'd left the seminary and married my wife Morag, and very late one night, after a few drinks, I was engaged in deep conversation with our next-door neighbor, a man called Mick. Unprompted by me, this man, as down-to-earth a Yorkshireman as you could imagine, a man who'd rarely entered a church in his life and who considered himself non-religious, told me of an experience that he had had which awakened memories of my own. It had happened a few years before. He was out of work, heavily in debt, and his first marriage was failing. He was feeling suicidal and went upstairs to lie in misery upon his bed. Suddenly, he felt himself engulfed by what he described as a golden light, and a feeling of protection and love came over him, and a strong sense, a certainty even, that his troubles would soon be over. For him, as for me, it lasted only seconds, but he was able to regather himself as a consequence of it and go ahead with a new confidence. It was, he said, interestingly, like being born again. Some years after this, I came across a number of books which helped me to put these two experiences in perspective. They were all based on work pioneered in the late 60s by Sir Alister Hardy, a zoologist, and, ironically, in view of general Unitarian suspicion of such things, a prominent English Unitarian. Hardy, after retiring as professor of zoology, had set up the Religious Experience Unit at Manchester College, Oxford. His contention, which he set out in his Gifford Lectures at Aberdeen University in 1965 and published a year later in a book called The Divine Flame, his contention was that religious experiences, far from being aberrations or the product of an overactive imagination, as some scientists might suppose, were indeed evidence of a divine reality which our culture has tended to ignore or even to ridicule. Hardy's colleague, David Hay, began a nationwide survey in Britain in which thousands of people were asked to respond to the following question: have you ever been aware of or influenced by a presence or power, whether you call it God or not, which is different from your everyday self? I'll repeat that question. Have you ever been aware of or influenced by a presence or power, whether you call it God or not, which is different from your everyday self? What was amazing to David Hay and his researchers was that 35% of the people polled answered yes to that question. They were further surprised to find that similar polls conducted in America yielded similar results. And Hay was to conclude that, extrapolating from the results of his own survey, about 15 million people in Britain would claim to have had some kind of religious or spiritual experience. More women than men responded affirmatively, which Hay thinks might be ascribed to Western culture, in which the passive and receptive qualities which openness to the experience inevitably involves are associated with femininity. And the better educated the respondent, the more likely they were to claim such an experience. But people who lacked tertiary or even secondary education were by no means unrepresented. And as you might expect, figures were higher for churchgoers, but atheists and agnostics claimed these experiences too, although they didn't necessarily call them religious. In fact, 25% of the atheists interviewed answered positively. Edward Robinson, who studied the results of Hay's survey, was struck by the number of respondents, 15%, who claimed to have had such an experience in childhood. And this prompted him to compile a book which contained dozens of examples of these early intimations of transcendence. Our reading today was one such experience which occurred when the woman was 4 or 5 years old. That such a thing would occur to one so young was surprising enough for researchers and writers in the 70s and 80s. It would have been even more surprising for an earlier worker in the field, a British doctor who lived in Canada called Richard Morris Buck, whose classic work, Cosmic Consciousness, was first published at the beginning of the 20th century. Buck, who lived before the advent of street surveys and opinion polls, did most of his research in his own armchair, reading the works of the great religious and literary figures of the world. He concluded that such people as Jesus, Muhammad, the Buddha, St. Paul, Dante, Shakespeare, William Wordsworth, Balzac, and Walt Whitman, over 50 in total, underwent life-transforming experiences because they had entered, however briefly, a state of consciousness as different from their everyday self-consciousness as normal human consciousness is from, say, the undifferentiated consciousness of babies or animals. He contended that these things occurred mainly to white males and that the optimum age at which they occurred was about 35. But in the light of contemporary research, it seems that Buck was wrong. And had he gone outside his library and actually spoken to ordinary people, he would have discovered that these experiences, which he detects in the lives of a few white males, are actually far more widespread than he supposed, and they cross all boundaries of race, age, and gender. As to their origin, we can only speculate. Buck believed they were signs of an evolving consciousness, which few were able to reach now, but which would become increasingly widespread. Some contemporary researchers, like Edward Robinson, follow Wordsworth's idea that this is our natural state, our original vision. That was the title of his book, The Original Vision, which we gradually lose as we grow older and shades of the prison house form around us. Some would say that God inspires these things, others that the process, however remarkable, is more natural than supernatural, and is really about gaining fleeting access to a higher or deeper self, which is much wiser than our everyday self, but which is always present, but of which we are generally unaware. There is also the possibility that they are nothing more than delusions or illusions, and the fact that they don't happen so often in any particular lifetime is probably something to be grateful for. Real skeptics will put them down to emotional reactions triggered by stress, or see them as nothing more than another ploy by our selfish genes to keep us from despair and to keep us reproducing. I find them very exciting, since they seem to suggest that we have a religious or spiritual sense which needs to be acknowledged and nurtured if we are to remain sane. They also suggest that a purely biological explanation of the origins of human life, its destination and purpose, is inadequate. This was certainly the view of Sir Alister Hardy. Those who have such experiences are often completely transformed in their thinking and their attitude. Walt Whitman describes how one transparent summer morning, he says, one transparent summer morning, he was lying on the grass when swiftly arose and spread around me the peace and knowledge that pass all the argument of the earth. And I know that the hand of God is the promise of my own. And I know that the Spirit of God is the brother of my own. And I know that all men ever born are also my brothers, and that women are my sisters and lovers, and that the kelson of creation is love. Notice the verb tenses in this passage. His actions are set in the past, but his knowledge is current. He lay on the grass, but he knows that love lies at the heart of creation. In another place, in Song of Myself, Whitman asks his reader the same question as the interviewer. He puts it like this: "Has never come to thee an hour, a sudden gleam divine, precipitating, bursting all these bubbles, fashions, wealth, these eager business aims, books, politics, art, amours, to utter nothingness?" Now I'll ask a question. Has a sudden gleam divine ever come to you? What age were you? What triggered it? Has it inspired you, deepened your religious sense, sustained or consoled you in times of trouble? Have you had more than one experience? Have you ever spoken about your experience? Or have you been reluctant to do so in case people think you're a bit strange? Do such things point to a higher reality, or do you favor more prosaic explanations? I leave you to work out what you think about these things for yourself. And if we just spend a moment or two now thinking about it, and perhaps later tonight or tomorrow or some other time, you can maybe talk to each other about your own personal experiences.